Welcome to the Associated Taxpayers of Idaho 74th Annual Conference. First, I want to thank everyone for being here with us today virtually. Thank you to our members, our sponsors, those of you that make this possible. Welcome to our constitutional officers, legislators, local government officials, and distinguished guests that are here with us today. This group is one of the most dynamic audiences of really any conference, and it's just a pleasure to have you, although not with us, joining us here today. To start, I'm going to go through a few housekeeping items. First, for those of you signing in for CLE CPE, we do have a landing page website. It's ati-taxinfo.com/2020. There you'll find our program, CLE, CPE sign-in, other information that you can look at and utilize during the conference. And to note, although today's conference is virtual, all of our presentations are live, whether they're Zoom, whether they're in studio. We wanted to give you all that interactive feel and ability to watch live and to interact with our speakers. Before I begin today's conference, I did want to start with an excerpt from our founding president from a cookbook that he started called Letters from Max. This is from 1984. This little tidbit is dedicated to all those grand people, those gone and those old and new friends who suffered through various occasions for which now seem so important. And with that, I'm going to begin our first session. Our first speaker today, I'm very pleased to welcome. His name is Marc Goldwein. He's Senior Vice President of the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. He has a very diverse background, both in topics related to fiscal policy, federal budget, essentially the fiscal state of our federal government. You may have seen him or may have heard him quoted on a number of news sources. His information is utilized similar to the ATI as a fact-finding type organization. He also teaches economics at Johns Hopkins University, where he was a 2013 recipient of the Excellent in Teaching Award. And he's also been featured in the Forbes 30 Under 30 list for law and policy. So with that distinguished background, I've also had the, I guess you could call it, pleasure of seeing him speak while I was in D.C. at a national taxpayers conference hosted by the Tax Foundation. I found it both fascinating and I guess you could call it, I was somewhat horrified by what we see in our federal debt and deficit. But regardless, it was enlightening and relative to what we see in Idaho, a very fascinating contrast. So we do have Marc here with us via Zoom, and with that, I'll introduce and welcome Marc. So thank you.
Well, thank you all so much for having me. Can everyone hear me okay? Miguel, maybe just give me a thumbs up so I know everything's working technically. Great. Let me just try to. Miguel, are you able to give me screen sharing ability? It looks like I'm not able to get to open up my slide deck.
I think we're getting to you, Marc. Just one moment.
Sure, thank you very much. Take your time. I'm really glad to be here. I wish that I was flying out there in person, but maybe this time next year. For those of you that haven't heard of the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, we are a totally nonpartisan organization here in Washington, D.C. We're a not-for-profit think tank. Our board of directors is some of the leading Democrat and Republican minds on budget issues in the country. And they disagree on a lot, but they generally agree we need responsible federal budgeting, which in good times, not in all times, but in good times means bringing our debt under control. Okay, so, and at least keeping our debt at manageable levels relative to the size of the economy. It looks like my deck is working now. So with that, let me get, excuse me, sorry about that. With that, let me get started. And let me open by talking about, and actually spend a lot of this talking about our current economic crisis and how the federal government has responded at the federal level. And then when I get through this, depending on how much time we have left, I'd love to take any questions. But I think we're all very aware the economy took a huge hit earlier this year as a result of the pandemic and the related shutdown orders and shelter in place and business changes. GDP really plummeted between quarter one, which is January, February, March, and quarter two, which is April, May, and June. GDP fell by 10%, right? So that's comparing a period of things were mostly normal, except for that bit at the end in March, to the period that many of us were, sheltering in place in our homes. GDP fell by about 10%. In some ways, that's a magnificent testament to, I think, really the resilience of the U.S. economy. The fact that when so many of us were, stuck in our homes, when so many businesses were shuttered, the U.S. As a country was still producing 90% as much as it usually did, is pretty amazing. On the other hand, a 10% fall in GDP is really devastating. GDP the economy has never contracted that deep, that fast. Even during the Great Depression, where GDP did fall further, it didn't fall that quickly. We've really never had such a sharp, devastating contraction in our economic output. Sorry about that. I realized the lighting there maybe is going to give some people headaches. So we saw that not just, and I should mention, by the way, we've recovered a lot of what we've lost. We don't have economic data yet for November, and I think it's November, December is going to be a bit rough. But through the third quarter, we recovered more than half of what we lost. More than half of that contraction we felt in that first quarter, we have since recovered. And that's good news, but there's still lots to go. Where the economy is still smaller than it was before the pandemic and much smaller than it would have otherwise been, with just regular growth. And that's felt in a number of households. In February, there were 152 million Americans working. There were about another 5 million unemployed, meaning that there were 5 million people looking for jobs that didn't have them. In April, at sort of the worst part of this pandemic, there were only 130 million Americans working. And that is in some ways is an overstatement because that counts some people that had jobs, were being paid, but weren't actually going in. Some employers were able to offer periods where they're paying workers to essentially not work. So we really had less than 130 million working, which means that there were 22 million people plus lost their jobs, plus the 5 million that didn't find new jobs. So there were 27, maybe by some measures, upwards of 30 million people out of work at the worst of this. Now, again, we've recovered a good amount of what we lost. As of August, 141 million were working. Today, it's probably more like 143 million. That's good news. But it still means that we're 8, 9, 10 million below where we were in February. We still have a long way to go until we get out of this, until the economy does really recover. Now, as devastating as this recession has been, especially in the second quarter, especially in the April, May, June, that was the worst of it. And that will be the worst of it from an economic perspective. The federal response was larger than anything the United States has ever done in its history. It was larger than anything any other country did, with the possible exception of Australia. We had a massive federal response at all levels of the federal government. My organization, the CRFB, has been tracking this response through a website called COVID Money Tracker. By our estimates, the administration, through sort of unilateral actions, committed about $600 billion to the response. Congress, through legislation, committed about $4 trillion. When I say committed, I mean this is sort of the up to amount. they would allow up to $4 trillion of response, and the Federal Reserve allowed for up to $7 trillion of response. Now, of that money, if I were to add it all together, which I shouldn't do, more than $5 trillion has gone out the door. That's pretty unbelievable. The U.S. economy in a typical year only produces 20 trillion, which means that, over a 6-month period when most of this was dispersed, they produced 10 trillion. So considering the United States in the entire country, every business, every household, every worker was producing about 10 trillion over that same period, the federal government was covering, in some ways, half of it. 5 trillion is pretty large, pretty unbelievable. It's a massive response. Legislatively, it happened through about 7 pieces of legislation. 3 major ones, one called the Families First Act, one called the CARES Act, and one called the very long name, the Paycheck Protection and Healthcare Extension Act, something like that, plus a bunch of smaller pieces. So through these 3 pieces of legislation, we allocated a lot of money. About $1.5 trillion of that went to what we call loan programs. I say loan programs because not all these are literal loans. So the biggest one is there was $670 billion allowed for something called the Paycheck Protection Program, which was essentially a grant to small businesses. Small businesses could go to the bank, get a loan equal to 10 weeks worth of payroll, but so long as they met certain criteria, like hiring back their workers eventually and using most of that money for their workforce and rent and things like that, they could get it forgiven. And so for most businesses, this will either be a pure grant or it'll mostly be a grant. Maybe you would take out $100,000 in loan and you're ultimately going to pay back $10,000 or $5,000. So this was essentially cash to small businesses to tide them over. We also had more traditional loans to small businesses called economic injury disaster loans through the SBA, and additional loans to the airline industry and others, plus support for the Federal Reserve to issue its own loans. In addition, there was a lot of tax policy. Most of this was delaying tax payments by businesses, giving businesses in a variety of ways sort of more liquidity, more time to pay and spread out their taxes. Some of it was also tax breaks for businesses, including for offering paid family leave and for retaining workers. We spent about $500 billion on unemployment benefits and other income support. This included a $600 per week bonus through the end of July. $600 per week is massive. The typical unemployment benefit is about $300 or $400. So we almost tripled unemployment benefits to the point that most workers through the end of July that were on unemployment were actually making more on unemployment, significantly more, maybe in some cases on average 40% more than what they were making in the workforce. We also expanded unemployment to cover gig workers and self-employed and increased the number of weeks. In addition, we sent everyone checks. Almost everyone got a check of $1,200 per person. There was an income cutoff. We provided extra money for state and local governments in a variety of ways, including to cover the COVID costs and for general funds on Medicaid, education, and transit. And we spent a lot of money on healthcare, including almost $200 billion to support healthcare providers like hospitals, and additional money to do things like develop the Moderna vaccine and pre-order the Pfizer vaccine and other things like that. There's a lot of money committed, $4 trillion. Now, of that $4 trillion, some of it was loans that will be paid back. Some of it was money that was allocated but won't ever be spent or hasn't been spent. Some of it was tax delays. And so the net cost of the federal government is not that $4 trillion. It's actually going to be something closer to $2.5 trillion. And you can see the loan program amount shrank significantly because, for one, not all of those paycheck protection loans were taken out. But more importantly, all those other loans, they're going to provide a lot of upfront cash to businesses, but they do need to be paid back over the long term. And so the cost of the federal government is going to be low. Similarly, a lot of those tax delays, the cost of the federal government is a lot lower than the near-term support we provided. Now, again, as I mentioned, this response was massive, bigger than anything we'd ever seen. If you add it all up over a 5-year period, so the numbers differ a little bit here, it's $2.5 trillion, which is essentially the same amount we spent on the Great Recession when you adjust for the size of the economy. The difference is the Great Recession legislation was spread out over a 6-year period. We had all sorts of legislation. We had the big stimulus bill. We had the TARP that rescued banks. We had the Fannie Freddie bailout. We had a payroll tax holiday. We had a bunch of extensions. That Great Recession response took 6 years to spread out. We did that much in the COVID response, mostly in the first 6 months. I'll just say this again. We spent as much in the first 6 months of this crisis to support the economy as we did over 6 years during the Great Recession. And it wasn't just federal fiscal policy. The Federal Reserve stepped in from the very beginning. As soon as it became clear the pandemic was coming, the Federal Reserve cut interest rates pretty quickly to zero. And on top of that, they essentially announced they will do whatever it takes to stabilize the economy. They purchased a ton of federal debt to basically allow Congress to enact that fiscal policy without having to worry about where they'll get the money. They bought mortgage-backed securities for fear there could be some kind of housing crisis or secondary market financial crisis. They created all sorts of liquidity facilities to make sure there was cash in every part of the financial sector. And they both revived and established a bunch of new lending facilities to support various sectors in the economy. They revived a lot of the Great Recession era facilities focused in the financial sectors, but also created 4 new big facilities, one to support these paycheck protection loans, but 3 others, corporate credit facility to basically just buy corporate bonds, Main Street lending program to support loans to small businesses, and a municipal lending facility to support loans to state and local governments. Now, these new facilities, the Fed announced they could be very large, 750 billion, 600 billion, and 500 billion, respectively, for those 3 facilities I mentioned. But they actually dispersed very little. They spent very little. The numbers I'm showing here are a bit out of date, so I'm going to round up. But out of the 750 billion, Federal Reserve said they would be willing to spend to buy corporate bonds, they've spent about 15 billion to date. Out of the 600 billion, they said they would spend to support, and when I say spend, I mean these are buying loans. They will get the money back. But they will spend for small business loans. They've spent a little bit over 5 billion now. 5 billion out of 600, not that many. Most of them in Florida and Texas. I don't know why. And out of this 500 billion, they said they would commit to support state and local governments by their bonds. They've actually only bought 2 bonds, one from the state of Illinois and one from New York's Metropolitan Transit Authority, MTA. So they've announced these very big facilities. They've really brought out the big guns, but they've fired very few shots. And that's probably okay. They probably didn't need to fire that many shots. They did, however, dramatically expand their balance sheet, mainly during the early parts of the crisis. They bought just a ton of federal bonds to make sure that the bond market was stable. There wouldn't be a financial crisis. And Congress and the president could do what they need to spend money without having to worry about, again, whether there will be other buyers, sufficient buyers. Just to kind of keep this going, it's not just been Congress and the Federal Reserve. The administration has acted unilaterally in a lot of ways. They told hospitals and other medical providers they would pay them this year for Medicare costs that in future years. They're sort of giving them an advance on their Medicare payments so they have the cash to make it through. That $600 bonus unemployment, when it ended in July, the administration picked up with a $300 bonus for an extra 5 or 6 weeks, which provided an important bridge for many unemployed workers. They've essentially put a hold on all student loan payments, so almost nobody is paying back their student loan debt, and there's no interest accruing over the time. They delayed tax day. Many people may remember from April 15th to July 15th. In total, they committed almost $600 billion to support the economy. It's not going to cost very much because most of that is delays, or changes that are ultimately going to be paid back later. But it provided the cash when the economy needed it. That was the key of this, is we had this 3-month-ish lockdown period where the economy really needed very sharp support, and it got that support. Now, we've been tracking all of this at covidmoneytracker.org. Sometimes in presentations, I try to go here and walk through the tool, but the combination of Zoom and the recording and the COVID Money Tracker makes things go too slow. So I'm just going to pull out a few snapshots. But I recommend you all checking this out on your own time, because it really shows every federal dollar, how much has been allocated, how much has been committed, how much has been dispersed, from the very top level down to the company or entity level. So for example, and we can filter. For example, I put in a filter for Idaho. How much money in total has gone to Idahoans, either Idaho state and local governments, Idaho businesses, or Idaho households? It's been about 10 billion, a little over 600 million supporting paycheck protection loans for the Federal Reserve, about 600 million from advance payments to hospitals under the administrative action, then another 9 billion of legislation, which, if this were the tool, I could click and zoom in and you can see what's there. About 3 billion supporting small businesses through the Paycheck Protection Program. This is money committed, not all allocated yet. Almost $1 billion more of economic injury disaster loans. Almost another $1 billion of healthcare spending, about half of that for Medicaid continuous coverage, about half of that grants to health providers. Another $1 billion of sending everyone checks. Another $1 billion of unemployment, another $2 billion of sending everyone's checks, and about $2 billion of state and local funding. Again, you could zoom in even more. So here I show, how much money was sent to colleges. It turns out that colleges and universities in Idaho got about $500 million. Got about 51 million. It looked like it said 500 million to me. Got 51 million. 18 million of that went to Brigham Young University. But you can see, Boise State got another 11 million. University of Idaho got 7 million. We provided funding to colleges to support them. In the healthcare sector, again, you can see how much went to Medicaid beneficiaries, how much went to rural hospitals, et cetera. So you can really dive deep. Backing up a little bit, just as I know a lot of people are interested in state and local funding. In total, Congress has committed about 280 billion to all state and local funding, not just Idaho, everywhere. About 85 billion of higher Medicaid matching rates, 25 billion of transit grants that are mostly covering existing transit costs, not new investments. 17 billion, that's mainly for K through 12 funding, and about 150 billion, what's called the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which is funds to states for new COVID-related expenses, whether public health or economic. Now, what kind of effect has this all had? I'm a fiscal hawk. I generally believe in lower deficits. But part of the reason we want to keep the debt low in normal times is so that we can borrow when we need to. And the 2 times we really need to borrow are if A, there's a deep recession and we need sort of the government to temporarily provide a boost to the economy, which it can do for short periods of time, or B, when there's a national emergency that has sharp costs that we want to spread over time. This is both. And so it made total sense to borrow right now. And it was really expensive, but it paid off. And I'll show you how. I want to focus on Q1 to Q2 because I really want to focus on what did we do to manage the worst parts of the recession. But I can talk about Q3 as well. The lockdown period. What did we do to prevent the lockdown? Remember I said that GDP fell by about 10% over that lockdown period. Market income, just kind of income per person, disposable income per person, fell by 8%, which is similar to 10%. That makes sense. Those numbers align. But when you add in all the government transfer programs, including the ones that were under current law, and the new ones from the COVID relief, unemployment, the recovery rebates, the paycheck protection, other things like that, disposable income actually rose 10% quarter over quarter. And this is massive. In a typical quarter, disposable income rises 1%. It rose 10%, 10 times. During a period that the economy was in deep recession, income grew 10 times its normal rate. This is massive. I don't think we've ever experienced a 10% quarter over quarter growth. Certainly not since we've been doing the modern ways of measuring. And so, if anything, we overcorrected from the first to second quarter. Now, it made sense to overcorrect some because we didn't know how bad the downturn would be. And because in retrospect, people have saved that money and used it for the third quarter when they didn't have as much fiscal support. But even still, we probably, we could have gotten away with spending less and still secured incomes. But the fact that income rose this much when GDP and market income fell is a huge testament to the success and even over success of fiscal monetary policy. If I were to extend this out to Q3, you'd see that income doesn't stay at that 10% boost, but it's still something like 5% higher than pre-COVID. And I think even in Q4, which won't be as good, will still be something like 2% above pre-COVID levels. We'll still be basically where we were supposed to be absent had there been no crisis at all, which is a pretty good deal overall. This support also really helps small businesses. Wasn't enough to save many businesses that can't make it through the pandemic, but it did save almost all businesses through that lockdown period. I call it a lockdown period. I know every state was different, but through that period where there were so many shutdowns, where many small businesses didn't have enough cash on hand to make it through. The PPP loans gave them the money to make it through. And over that period, businesses made adjustments. They figured out how to work within the pandemic. They're not all thriving now. Some are, but many are still suffering. But the relief provided them the money to make it through that worst period. It provided them that bridge funding. And hopefully there can be some more money in the way. We also stabilized bond markets. Remember I said the Federal Reserve didn't actually use those lending facilities very much. It turns out they didn't have to. I apologize for moving my laptop. It's a very sunny day. Just by announcing that they were going to have these new facilities, they calmed the markets. You can see here, bond yields were really starting to spike. And then the Federal Reserve just announced they were going to launch these new bond buying programs. Immediately, the bond market stabilized. When they started buying those bonds, it stabilized even more, even though the Federal Reserve barely bought any. Because just by showing they were actually doing the facility, that was enough to calm actual private sector buyers and keep the bond market under control. And we got states and localities on average through 2020 just fine. There were fears there were going to be massive revenue shortfalls in states. Most states are indeed facing significant revenue shortfalls, but the aid that we provided was enough to get them through fiscal year 2020, which ended in June. And for many states, along with their rainy day funds and some modest adjustments, will be enough to get them through 2021. For some states, it won't. 2021 is going to be very rough for some states. Some states are doing furloughs. Or here in Washington D.C., they're closing down my metro, for example. So some states are going to make tough choices now in some localities as well. But we got them through 2020. The state of Idaho, as you can kind of see in this map, got about $1.8 billion of federal aid, which definitely made a difference. That's about $1,000 per person per capita, which kind of makes it a medium state overall in terms of how much it got. That's a big deal. That provided a lot of bridge for that period. Again, that shutdown period where states were not collecting a lot of sales tax. And my understanding of Idaho now, I hope, is that you all are going to be able to get back on your feet, and with the help of that federal aid plus some indirect aid, we'll be doing just fine. We also probably prevented a depression. I can't prove or counterfactual. I know many economists were very concerned that this pandemic crisis would turn into a financial crisis. It did not. GDP contracted 10%, which is awful, but it could easily have contracted by 15%. Some were projecting, which I thought was an overprojection, but some people were projecting even a 25% contraction. I don't think that was ever realistic, but I think that things could have been a lot worse, and the rebound could have been much slower than it was. And we have, in part, to thank for that, the resilience and adaptability of the U.S. economy, but in part, the efforts of fiscal and monetary policy, which made a big difference, I think. But we're not out of the woods yet. There's a vaccine. There's 2 vaccines that seem to work very well, and 1 vaccine that I'm hopeful, once they get the dosage right, will work. I think there's a good case that by the spring and summer, things are going to start to be really normal, but we have a very dark winter ahead of us. The virus is spreading at really the fastest rate it ever has. A lot of states and localities are suffering and are doing furloughs and layoffs. Small businesses, especially ones that rely on things like outdoor dining, may not make it through the winter. Joblessness is still very high. And most federal aid has ended or will end on December 31st. And so there, in my opinion, is a need for more fiscal relief, but probably just one more bridge package to get us from here to the spring, summer, when the vaccine will be widely disseminated and this pandemic will be behind us, and we can focus on really rebuilding the economy. I want to get to Q&A, but just to make sure that you don't leave being too happy, I also want to point out that in the process of doing the right thing and supporting the economy, we totally blew up a deficit that was already out of control. In 2019, the deficit was $1 trillion. That is massive. It's basically twice as high as it needed to be because starting the late Obama era and especially in the Trump era, we passed a bunch of spending increases and tax cuts that we didn't pay for. And so we started this thing with $1 trillion deficit. Last year, 2020, the deficit tripled to $3 trillion. And while it is going to be lower this year, I don't expect the deficit to ever fall below $1 trillion again. And Meanwhile, I expect debt to explode. Debt is now larger than the economy for the first and only time in our history, other than World War II. The only time in our history we've had it up above 100% is after World War II. Under current law, meaning if Congress stops doing irresponsible things, which seems unlikely, debt is headed for 110% of GDP by 2030, is projected to double the size of the economy by 2050, maybe be 2.5 size of the economy. There really is only one country in the world that has had debt levels close to these levels and not either needed a correction or a crisis, and that's Japan. And Japan has gone 30 years without economic growth. They should not be our lead example. Um, During the campaign, we estimated the Biden and Trump campaign plans, with Biden being the president-elect. I've removed Trump from this calculus, but his numbers are actually quite similar, which is that we estimated that if you enact the full Biden agenda, instead of debt being 109% of GDP, it's in our best guess scenario going to be 127% of GDP. In other words, Biden will add about $5.5 trillion to the debt. Trump would have added 5 trillion. So, lest you think, things would have been far better. Both candidates were proposing to really blow up the debt. By the way, for more depressing news, all major trust funds are at risk of insolvency. Highway Trust Fund which is funded by the gas tax, is going to run next year. Medicare by 2024, disability by 2026, Social Security by 2031, maybe 2033 under some alternative estimates. I've been going around for years saying we got to save Social Security for my 3-year-old daughter. You got to save it for your grandkids. But the truth of the matter is, somebody that's retiring today at 62 will only be 73 years old when Social Security runs out. We don't need to save it for our grandkids. We got to save it for our parents and grandparents. Social Security is running out fast. And if we don't come up with more funds, it's going to be across the board benefit cut. Now, good news. President-elect Biden is not going to get his $5.5 trillion, I don't think, of campaign promises. There's going to either be divided government or, in the best case scenario for Democrats, he's going to have the slimmest of majorities and need to count on moderate Democrats to support even anything that doesn't take 60 votes. So everything's going to really require bipartisanship. And there's bipartisan support for doing a lot of good stuff. There's bipartisan support for more bridge support for the economy, more loans and support for small businesses, some unemployment benefits. I think not 600 a week, that's too much, but maybe 300 a week, until we get through this pandemic. There's also bipartisan support for lowering healthcare costs. The parties actually agree on a lot of ways that we can get healthcare costs down that would benefit not only the deficit, but ordinary Americans. We can ban surprise billing. We can lower drug prices by encouraging the use of generics and preventing drug companies from overcharging for costs beyond inflation. We can start paying hospitals and doctors the same prices for the same services. The parties agree, I think, mostly on improving tax compliance. They disagree strongly on whether taxes should be higher or lower, but almost everyone agrees people should pay the taxes they owe, right? And we can do that by improving the IRS, but also by closing some egregious loopholes and giving more authority for tax compliance. The parties also agree on there's bipartisan agreement on fixing a lot of problems with the budget process and on strengthening our trust funds. They don't agree on how, but they agree we have to address the highway, Medicare, Social Security before they run out. And there's a bill supported by Senators Romney and Manchin that's got bipartisan support in the House and Senate called the Trust Act. It would create new rescue committees that could come up with ideas for these trust funds. Here it just shows you some of the ideas to support the economy and how much they would do in terms of bang for buck. Here's some of the policies that have bipartisan support for health and revenue. There is light at the end of the tunnel here, certainly related to the pandemic there is, but also on fiscal policy. We just need our policymakers to walk towards it. So at this point, I would happily take any questions, and thank you all for having me.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. Miguel here again. As I thought when we were in DC, truly fascinating information and kind of tough to understand just because of the sheer volume and amount of figures we're talking about, how it looks, how it is, how it will be. But one question I have here, which is kind of a series of questions, so I'll ask them and tell me if you need any repeating. But where do the massive amounts of money come from? New notes? Sold to whom? When? concerns that buyers might dry up or insist that on higher interest rates in addition to inflation risks. So I can repeat any one of those are all interrelated,
Yeah.
but
No, I think I can answer that question. So, um, in a typical year, we're borrowing $1 trillion. That's a problem, in my opinion. That's a problem we need to deal with. It's not a problem in the sense that no one is there to buy the $1 trillion. Um, Between foreign purchasers and domestic savers, especially people that are um, young baby boomers that are actually shifting their portfolios to safer assets like bonds, there's enough buyers for the $1 trillion a year deficits for now. Um, Last year we borrowed $3 trillion. So I think the real question is, where did that extra $2 trillion come from? And it really came from two sources. Most of it came from the Federal Reserve, not directly. The Federal Reserve does not directly buy U.S. debt, but the Federal Reserve bought about $1.5 trillion more of debt from the private markets, which means that indirectly they essentially, in some, they wouldn't call it this, but in some ways we monetize the debt. You can't do that in normal times to a significant degree, but when demand is significantly depressed, when money isn't moving as quickly, and for a variety of reasons, the Federal Reserve was able to do that without having any inflation. Perhaps they did increase inflation, but even then they increased it to below the target. And so in the near term, the Federal Reserve was able to cover some of the costs. It doesn't make it free. The Federal Reserve at some point is either going to have to unwind those bonds, either sort of sell them back out to the market, or they're going to pay interest on their reserves. But what that does allow us to do is sort of spread the borrowing over a long period of time, or possibly inflate some of it away in a gradual way, hopefully not in an abrupt inflation way. That was really the key source of most of that. The additional money came from the fact mainly that Americans are saving a ton more through this crisis, especially in the near term. And so if you look at most of what the Federal Reserve was doing, they were buying long-term bonds. But if you look at most of what the federal government was issuing, it was very short-term bonds that are essentially financed through money market accounts. So you put your money in the bank, it becomes available for the federal government for short-term lending. And that's really where the rest of it came from. There's a massive increase in savings for really two reasons. Three reasons. Number one, income went way up. And that was a lot of that was because federal governments sent people a bunch of cash. And so people got these extra checks. They were making $700 a week from their job, and suddenly they were making $1,000 a week from unemployment. They were getting their $1,200 check. These people had all this extra money. And so they didn't suddenly increase their spending habits. They put it into the bank. So that's number one, the higher income increased savings. Number two, it's actually a lot harder to spend money in pandemic. I don't know if you all have noticed, but I'm not going out to a lot of restaurants. I'm not doing any air travel. I am buying more at Amazon, but overall it's harder to spend money in a pandemic. And so there's just less ways to spend. And so that leads to more savings. And I'm not spending for my commute to work because my commute is I go up the stairs. And then number three, as is typical of most recessions, people are saving more as a precaution because they're worried about what's next, especially if you're out of work. Even if you're out of work and your income was up through July, you didn't know what was going to happen next, and your income was maybe going to be down. But even people that are employed are saving more as a precaution. So for those three reasons, Americans saved a lot more, and that offered a lot more money to the bond markets. It's not clear we can repeat that again indefinitely. I don't think we can borrow $3 trillion a year without the markets responding either with higher interest rates or the Fed having to step in which case we risk higher inflation. And so this isn't something you can do whenever you want, but it's something that you have to do. You should do during a crisis. This is exactly the right time to take the hit, except that we are going to be a little bit worse off as a society each year as a result of protecting us from being in a horrible situation this year. And that is a worthwhile trade-off. It is worthwhile to borrow from the future bit by bit to prevent devastation today. This is exactly the time that you should be borrowing.
here's another one for you. How close are we to rehypothecation, which you may need to define?
To what?
To rehypothecation, which basically the practice whereby banks and brokers use for their own purpose assets that have been posted and collateral by their clients who permit collateral to be compensated either through a lower cost of borrowing or rebate on fees. I probably pronounced it wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a finance guy. I don't think I can answer that question. What I can say is that um, through a variety of techniques, including the Paycheck Protection Program, the Economic Injury Development Loan straight from the SBA, the Main Street Lending Facility, and others, um, the United States has allowed for a lot of this of uncollateralized debt um, on and guaranteed a lot of uncollateralized debt for small businesses and others, and that's not going to continue over the long term. But I'm not a banking guy, so I can't tell you exactly how banks are going to respond.
No, I appreciate that. I wasn't even able to pronounce it, so thanks for taking a stab at that question. But I do have one more of interest. Is there a risk of a double dip recession when some of these programs go away and there is no additional government stimulus?
Yeah, I think a very mild double dip recession, mild in the sense that the second dip will be low, severe in the sense that it comes from a very low place. But I think a very mild further dip is likely to occur. Um, Not per se because the stimulus ran out, more because the virus spread is really bad right now. And the winter makes economic adaptation harder. I mean, and maybe it's not so bad in Southern California or in Florida, but um, outdoor dining doesn't really work in DC in December, January. So I think a shallow double dip, but stuff from low, is actually quite likely thanks to that. Now, it's not mainly because of the fiscal stimulus expiring. Most of the fiscal stimulus has already expired. Um, but the fact that it is expired and will expiring is going to make that worse, and continuing or re-upping the stimulus could prevent it. So if policymakers can reach a deal in the next 2 weeks to extend pandemic unemployment insurance, which is sort of that expanded unemployment for gig workers, to provide some additional boost in unemployment benefits, and I think really importantly this time, to provide some targeted relief to small businesses, especially in the restaurant sector and other businesses where there really is no way to safely be indoors in big crowds. I think that can prevent the shallow double dip recession, even though the cause isn't really the lack of fiscal policy. The cause is really the winter and the expansion of the virus.
Well, Mark, I think that's actually a great question to end on. As I found when we were in DC as our taxpayer conference, and I know the groups that you presented to, we've talked about your numbers and data, since we're numbers and data people, a number of times, and it's truly fascinating and interesting to contrast, especially when we're looking at our own state and our own budget and where our federal government's heading in parallel or in addition to that. So with that, I'd like to thank you for joining us. It's just a real pleasure to have you, and I think you provided some great information for us here in Idaho. We're actually going into a state budget. We're going into a state budget presentation right now, which will be interesting as we compare what you just spoke to relative to our state. So thank you for opening this up, and really appreciate the time.
Well, thank you for having me. Anyone can feel free to reach out to me at goldwein@crfp.org. I apologize for some of the lighting issues, but I was really glad to be here, and maybe next year I will see some of you in person.
Much appreciated, Mark. Thank you. And for those of you still on the line, we're going to take just a few moments to get set up for our next speaker, which will be Alex Adams. He'll be live in the studio, so we'll take a momentary break and be right back.